At the beginning of the 20th century, the British Empire was still the largest territorial power in the world. With colonies spread across 3 continents and dominance over global trade routes, it was a superpower both economically and militarily. However, its global supremacy was not based solely on its vast territories or trade networks. The real foundation of this dominance was the Royal Navy, the undisputed master of the seas. The Navy was not only a military force, but also a symbol of national pride. Britain's sense of security as an island nation was made possible by its control of the oceans. Therefore, naval superiority was seen by the British public as a guarantee of both prosperity and freedom. 58 out of every 100 calories consumed by the British came from overseas. For centuries, Britain had maintained absolute supremacy at sea, shielding itself from the destructive effects of continental wars. Since Trafalgar, the belief that he who rules the waves rules the world had become a national conviction. Thus, for the British, the Navy was a guarantee of security, the island's primary line of defence. Yet this sense of security and maritime dominance would not be enough to guarantee peace. Throughout the 19th century, Britain had pursued a strategy known as splendid isolation. Based on the natural geographical advantages of being an island and its maritime power, this policy allowed London to avoid entanglement in European alliance systems during times of crisis and war. Instead, it maintained flexible positions according to its own interests and intervened militarily or diplomatically when necessary. However, at the dawn of the 20th century, this strategy began to falter seriously. The global economic balance was shifting. Germany had made tremendous industrial advances over the last quarter century, and with its growing production capacity and trade power, it had become a direct rival to Britain. The United States was also expanding rapidly and beginning to play a significant role in global commerce. Britain was no longer the uncontested ruler of world trade. This growing competition was making Britain economically more vulnerable. The intensifying rivalry with Russia in Central Asia and the Far East, along with France's desire to expand in Africa, would push Britain away from its role as a detached balancer and towards seeking alliances. A turning point in Anglo-German relations was about to unfold. Germany's young ruler, Kaiser Wilhelm, was deeply fascinated by all things military and had a particular passion for naval power. As part of his Weltpolitik world policy, which aimed for Germany to reach the top in every domain, the Kaiser read The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, a book written in 1894 by Alfred Mahan. Greatly influenced by the work, Wilhelm immediately began devising plans to expand Germany's naval strength. He requested funding from the Reichstag for 36 cruisers, but was only granted approval for 4. The German parliament did not share the Kaiser's vision. In response, Wilhelm recalled Alfred von Tirpitz from his post in the Far East in 1897. Like the Kaiser, Tirpitz believed the Navy had to be developed to a point where it could at least rival Britain's Royal Navy. After discussions between the two, Germany decided to implement a series of fleet acts. From 1898 to 1912, these laws would systematically strengthen the German Navy, allowing it to assert itself both in European waters and on the high seas. Germany's aggressive naval expansion sparked an uneasy rivalry between the two nations. The peak of this naval race was marked by the launch of HMS Dreadnought, a vessel that symbolized not just a warship, but the end of one era and the dawn of another. This massive battleship was a revolution in naval warfare. It was named after an English warship from the 16th century that had helped defeat the Spanish Armada. The name Dreadnought, meaning fearless, reflected the spirit of the new vessel. This Leviathan of the Royal Navy rendered all existing battleships obsolete at once. Armed entirely with large caliber guns, it featured a main battery of 10 12-inch 305 mm guns, far surpassing the firepower of contemporary warships. Instead of traditional coal-fired engines, it was powered by turbine engines, which were lighter and more efficient. These engines allowed the ship to reach a then stunning speed of 21 knots. In speed, range, and firepower, the Dreadnought achieved overwhelming superiority. Newspapers of the time rightly called it a revolution. Yet this technological triumph also marked the beginning of a nightmare. For the Germans, this development was a major challenge. To respond to Britain's great leap forward, the German Navy would push its production capacity to the limit, working tirelessly to build its own dreadnoughts. Tirpitz's formula was simple. In his eyes, a powerful navy represented far more than the barrels of battleships. It was a weight at the diplomatic table, a tool of international pressure and, if necessary, blackmail. Tirpitz had no intention of engaging the British fleet in a direct naval confrontation. His plan was to build a force that, even if not equal to the British fleet, could still inflict severe damage. That way, London would think twice before declaring war on Germany, knowing it would pay a heavy price. This theory would later be known as the risk theory. The naval laws of 1898 and 1900 were passed through the German parliament based on this strategic calculation. Officially, the new fleet was framed as a means to protect German interests. But the reality was different. Germany wanted to strike at the nerves of the British Empire. While planning the fleet's size and its new warships, Tirpitz deliberately targeted Britain's emotional weakness, its national pride in naval supremacy. If Germany could reach 60% of the strength of the British Navy, war would be too risky for London, thus giving Germany diplomatic leverage. But this plan provoked an unexpected reaction in Britain. Public pressure on the government reached its peak. The people demanded a response to Germany. In 1909, a massive naval campaign was launched under public pressure. Its most famous slogan became, "We want 8 and we won't wait." The public was shouting, "We want 8 battleships and we won't wait." At the time, Winston Churchill was serving as Home Secretary. After negotiations on the naval program, he summarized the outcome with characteristic wit. The Admiralty wanted 6, the economists recommended 4, and we finally settled on 8. But the arms race was no longer limited to naval competition. Crises, such as the Moroccan episodes at the beginning of the 20th century, brought Britain and Germany face to face and revealed a deepening sense of mistrust. These crises would ultimately lead Britain to abandon its policy of splendid isolation entirely. Facing the rising threat of Germany, Britain signed the Entente Cordial with France. Initially, this agreement was not a military alliance but a mutual understanding concerning conflicting colonial interests. In the final quarter of the 19th century, Britain and France had experienced numerous tensions. Crises like the Fashoda incident in Sudan had brought the two empires to the brink of war. Africa had become the focal point of both Britain's and France's imperial ambitions. Control over the Nile and clashes over interests in West Africa created chronic friction between the two. However, the rise of Germany helped to push this old rivalry into the background. For both London and Paris, standing united against a common threat became a more rational choice than competing with each other. The Entente Cordiale was born under these circumstances. Britain secured France's recognition of its control over Egypt, while in return, It pledged not to interfere with French interests in Morocco. Other smaller colonial disputes were also settled under the agreement. Yet over time, the influence of the Entente Cordial extended far beyond colonial matters. The climate of trust it created laid the groundwork for both countries to draw even closer as the German threat intensified. The First Moroccan Crisis, triggered by Germany's intervention in Morocco in 1905, accelerated this process. Germany's challenge to French influence in Morocco sent shockwaves through Paris. When the French realized they could not stand alone against such pressure, they turned to London for support. For the British, too, Germany's aggressive diplomacy was cause for concern. Britain had long sought to prevent any single power from establishing hegemony over the European continent. Germany's increasing boldness showed that Britain's old balance of power policies had once again become vital. In this context, secret military preparations began to take shape. Confidential military talks were held between the French and British general staffs. These meetings discussed how the British Army would assist and where it would be deployed in the event of a European war. However, the British government, wary of the anti-war sentiments within the Liberal Party, wanted to keep this military alignment out of public view. Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey maintained the policy of official neutrality by ensuring even Parliament was not informed of these talks. The British public had no idea which side their government might choose in a future European war. Germany would shake the status quo so profoundly that Britain and France, longtime enemies for nearly 1,000 years, would find themselves bound by a shared fate. And Germany wasn't just unsettling these two great powers. Russia, too, was increasingly anxious about its rising and growing neighbour. While negotiating with the French, the British also began courting the Russians. In 1907, the signing of the Anglo-Russian Entente would pave the way for what history would come to know as the Triple Entente. While Britain was forging new alliances abroad, its internal structure was far more fractured. The empire was not as solid as it appeared from the outside. Political and social balances within the island were hanging by a thread. Internally, the radical wing of the Liberal Party opposed military preparations, while Conservatives demanded a tougher stance against Germany. Even within cabinet meetings, deep divisions emerged, and there was no consensus on national defence policy. These disagreements were not limited to Parliament. Major cities across the island were shaken by social unrest. The Liberal Party, which came to power in 1906, embarked on a wave of welfare reforms. Under the leadership of Lloyd George, laws concerning pensions, unemployment insurance, and the protection of workers' rights were introduced. However, these reforms met fierce resistance from the upper class and the House of Lords. The uneven distribution of growing prosperity within the country stirred the masses into action. As war loomed, the British working class launched a wave of strikes that would go down in history as the Great Unrest. From coal mines to ports, railways to textile mills, hundreds of thousands of workers across the country went on strike due to poor working conditions. These strikes not only demanded better wages, but also called for job security, union rights, and humane working conditions. The deployment of the army by employers and the government in response was a clear sign of rising tensions and internal division. The unrest wasn't purely economic. The struggle of women for political rights opened another front of conflict across the nation. Suffragettes, frustrated by years of peaceful campaigning with no results, began turning to more militant tactics. From 1912 onward, acts of arson, window smashing, and hunger strikes became a part of daily life. The government's harsh responses, especially the forced feeding of hunger-striking prisoners, inflicted serious wounds on the public conscience. As if these upheavals weren't enough, the most fragile issue facing the United Kingdom, the Irish question was entering a new and dangerous phase. In 1912, Prime Minister Asquith's Liberal government reintroduced the long-debated Home Rule Bill to Parliament. This bill aimed to grant limited autonomy to Ireland, including the establishment of a parliament in Dublin and the devolution of certain local powers to the Irish. However, this move was seen as an act of betrayal by the Ulster movement. In Ulster, especially among Protestant workers and the bourgeoisie, there was deep fear that being governed by a Catholic majority would reduce them to minority status and jeopardize their religious rights. Under the leadership of Edward Carson, the Unionist movement openly resisted the law by proclaiming the Ulster Covenant, which was signed by over 500,000 people in 1912. The Protestants feared that if Ireland were ruled by the Catholic majority, their religious freedoms and social standing would be in danger. This fear wasn't confined to rhetoric. In 1913, the Ulster Volunteer Force was formed, a paramilitary militia of 100,000 men created to resist Home Rule. The Ulster Volunteers would soon begin secretly importing weapons from Germany. As the world hurtled toward war, the United Kingdom was on the brink of fighting one within its own borders. In response, Irish Catholic nationalists also established their own paramilitary group, the Irish Volunteers. Now, Ireland had two separate armies, each seemingly preparing for a civil war. As the clouds of war gathered over Europe, the island was already caught in a storm. The Irish issue, which would be postponed by the outbreak of World War I, remained a ticking time bomb for the United Kingdom.